I didn't cry at my husband's funeral. Not because I didn't love him. Quite the opposite. 52 years of marriage don't disappear in a flood of tears. They settle somewhere deeper, heavier, like a stone you carry inside your chest. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, threatening rain, but never quite committing. It felt appropriate, like the world itself couldn't decide whether to grieve or simply move on. I sat in the front row, hands folded tightly in my lap. My fingers ached from how hard I was pressing them together, but I welcomed the sensation. It kept me grounded. My name is Mary Caldwell. I am 71 years old, and that morning, I buried my husband. To my right sat my son, Daniel. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes red, but dry. He had always been like that, even as a child. He carried his pain quietly, as if showing it would somehow make things worse. I worried about him more than I worried about myself. Funny how that works, even after all these years. The minister spoke in a calm, practiced voice about devotion, legacy, and love. Words meant to comfort. Words people expect to hear at moments like this. But all I could think about was the silence waiting for me at home. No more footsteps in the hallway. No more arguments about the thermostat. No more mornings with him reading the newspaper aloud like the world depended on my opinion of every headline. Just silence. When the service ended, people stood slowly, like they were waking from a shared dream. Someone touched my shoulder. Daniel helping me up. "Careful, Mom," he whispered. I nodded. I hated that word now. Careful. As if I could break any more than I already had. We walked toward the casket together. The polished surface reflected the dim light above, almost like a mirror, but I avoided looking too closely. I wasn't ready to see myself like that. Widowed. I placed my hand on the wood. Cold. Final. "Goodbye, Thomas," I whispered. And then I heard it. A voice behind me. Soft, but not soft enough. "Maybe she should have gone with him," a woman muttered, followed by a quiet, careless laugh. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew that voice. Clara. My daughter-in-law. Daniel's wife. The same woman who had hugged me just minutes earlier, whispering how heartbroken she was. For a moment, everything inside me went still. Not shattered. Not broken. Just still. You see, grief is strange. It doesn't always explode. Sometimes it sharpens. And in that moment, something inside me hardened in a way I hadn't felt in years. Daniel didn't hear her. He was speaking with the minister, his voice low, distracted. Good. He didn't need more pain. Not yet. As we walked toward the exit, people stopped us, offering condolences, squeezing my hands, telling me how strong I was. I smiled. I thanked them. I played my role perfectly. I had been doing that for decades. But inside, my mind had already gone somewhere else. 7 years back, to a moment I had buried so deeply, I almost convinced myself it never happened. Almost. It was a warm afternoon when everything began to unravel. I remember because I had packed Thomas's favorite lunch, roast beef sandwich, extra horseradish, just the way he liked it. We didn't celebrate our anniversary with grand gestures anymore. Not at our age. But small things still mattered. That day was one of them. His office was across town, in a glass building that reflected the skyline like it belonged there more than anything else. He had built his company from nothing. Brick by brick. Deal by deal. I was proud of him. Always had been. The receptionist smiled when I walked in. He just stepped out for a meeting, she said. But you can wait in his office. So I did. I set the lunch down on his desk and looked around. Everything was neat, organized, predictable, just like him. That's when I noticed the computer. Still on. An email open. I wasn't the kind of woman who snooped. At least, I hadn't been. But something about the subject line caught my eye. A transfer confirmation. And another. And another. At first, I thought it was business as usual. Then I saw the names. Clara. and someone else. I sat down slowly. My heart didn't race. It didn't pound. It sank. The kind of sinking that feels endless. The emails stretched back months. Quiet transactions. Small amounts. Carefully spaced. But together, they told a different story. Money was disappearing. Not by accident. Not by mistake. But deliberately. And Clara, she wasn't just involved. She was leading it. I remember the exact sentence that made my hands go cold. They're too old to notice. We can take a little more. Too old. I stared at those words for a long time. Not angry. Not yet. Just aware. Something had shifted. Something I would never be able to unsee. I printed everything. Every email. Every detail. Every betrayal. And then I made a choice. Not out of weakness. Not out of fear. But out of protection. For my son. For my grandchildren. For the fragile illusion of family. I buried the truth. Locked it away. And for 7 years, I said nothing. Now, standing outside the chapel, rain finally beginning to fall, I realized something. Silence has a cost. And I had been paying it for far too long. Clara walked ahead of us, already on her phone, her voice low and irritated, as if this entire day was an inconvenience. I watched her carefully. For the first time, not as family, but as a stranger. A dangerous one. Tomorrow the will would be read. She thought she knew what was coming. She thought I was just a grieving old woman. She was wrong. Because what Clara didn't know was that I still had everything. Every email. Every proof. Every secret she thought had disappeared. And this time, I wasn't going to stay silent. The morning after the funeral felt unnaturally quiet, as if the entire world had decided to lower its voice out of respect, or perhaps indifference. I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because sleep had refused to stay with me for long. The house felt unfamiliar, without Thomas. Every creak, every shadow, every empty chair reminded me that something permanent had shifted. I moved through the kitchen slowly, making coffee out of habit rather than desire, listening to the hollow echo of my own footsteps. For years, mornings had begun with his voice, his predictable complaints, his steady presence. Now there was only silence, and my thoughts. And my thoughts had teeth. They kept returning to Clara's words at the funeral. Not the cruelty itself. I had seen cruelty before, but the carelessness of it. The arrogance. The assumption that I was already irrelevant. That I wouldn't hear. That even if I did, it wouldn't matter. That I was too old, too broken, too passive to respond. She didn't know me. Or perhaps she knew only the version of me I had allowed her to see. I carried my coffee into the study, the one room in the house that still felt like Thomas lingered in it. His chair remained slightly pulled out, as if he had just stood up and would return any moment. I ran my fingers along the desk before opening the drawer I hadn't touched in months. Inside, beneath neatly stacked documents and old contracts, was a small velvet pouch. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight, not heavy in a physical sense, but significant in every other way. Inside was a key. Not just any key. A decision. 7 years ago, I had placed something in a safe deposit box across town. Something I told myself I would never need. Something I hoped would remain buried forever. Hope is a fragile thing. I closed my hand around the key and leaned back in the chair, allowing the memory to surface fully this time. Not in fragments, not softened by time, but exactly as it had happened. That day in Thomas's office had not ended when I printed the emails. That had only been the beginning. I remember leaving the building with a strange sense of calm. Not peace, never that, but clarity. The kind that comes when the truth is too undeniable to ignore. I got into my car and sat there for a few minutes, staring straight ahead, letting the realization settle. My daughter-in-law had been stealing from us. From the company. From the life Thomas had built over decades. And she had done it with confidence. With intention. With contempt. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove across town.
To him.
The man who had helped her. Idiot Graves. Our accountant. A quiet man. Nervous by nature. The kind who avoided eye contact in crowded rooms and apologized even when he hadn't done anything wrong. He had worked for us for years. Reliable. Predictable. Until he wasn't. His office was small, tucked between a pharmacy and a law firm that always looked too expensive to enter. When I walked in, he looked up and froze the moment he saw my face.
I didn't need to say anything.
He knew. People like Elliot always know when the truth has caught up with them. I closed the door behind me and placed the printed emails on his desk. Explain, I said. My voice was calm, colder than I expected. He didn't even try to deny it. That was the first thing that surprised me. The second was how quickly he broke. He started talking immediately. Too fast, too desperate, like a man trying to outrun something already standing in front of him. According to him, Clara had approached him months earlier. She had framed it as something temporary, an adjustment, a short-term shift of funds that would be returned before anyone noticed. He claimed he hesitated. I believed that part. Men like Elliot always hesitate before doing something wrong. But hesitation is not the same as refusal. She said she'd destroy me, he admitted, his hands shaking. She said she'd tell Daniel I'd crossed a line, that I made her uncomfortable, that I tried something at the company party. I watched him carefully. There was no performance in his voice, only fear. She said she had pictures, he continued, that she could make it look real. And just like that, it made sense.
Not just the theft,
but the method, the manipulation. Clara didn't rely on opportunity. She created leverage. I remember standing there listening, feeling something shift inside me again, not shock this time, but recognition. The version of Clara I had believed in, the charming, attentive, occasionally sharp-tongued but ultimately decent woman, collapsed completely in that moment. In her place stood someone else. Someone calculated. Someone dangerous. You're going to fix this, I told him. He nodded immediately.
Yes.
Yes, I will. I can return everything. I have savings. I can. You will return every dollar, I interrupted. Quietly, without delay. And then you will resign. He blinked, surprised. You're not going to the police? I held his gaze.
No.
Even now, I remember the exact moment I made that decision. Not because it was easy, but because it wasn't. Exposing Clara would have been justified. It would have been correct. It would have protected the company in a clean, undeniable way. But it would have destroyed Daniel, and my grandchildren, and Thomas, and perhaps, in some way, even me. So I chose something else. Something harder. Silence. You will leave, I continued. You will never contact her again. And you will consider this your second chance. He agreed. Of course he did. Men like Elliot don't argue when they're spared. I left his office with copies of everything. Not just the emails, but records, confirmations, evidence that couldn't be denied if it ever came to that. Then I went to the bank, opened the safe deposit box, and locked the truth away. For 7 years, I carried that knowledge, not as a burden I complained about, but as one I accepted. I watched Clara at family dinners. I listened to her comments, subtle, sometimes cutting, always carefully disguised. I saw the way she spent money, the way she presented herself, the way she positioned herself next to Daniel as if everything he had built was somehow hers to manage. And I said nothing. For Daniel. For Emma and Lucas. For the illusion of peace. But silence doesn't erase truth. It preserves it. Waiting. Now, sitting in the study with that same key in my hand, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. I hadn't protected the family. I had protected Clara. And she had used that protection to become bolder, crueler, more careless. I stood up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy, like it hadn't finished what it started. Not this time, I said quietly. This time, things would be different. Tomorrow, the will would be read. And
Well,
after that, the truth would finally decide where it belonged. I slipped the key into my pocket, and for the first time in 7 years, I was ready to use it. The law office didn't change, but everything else had. I had been there many times over the years with Thomas, signing contracts, reviewing documents, discussing decisions that shaped not just our business, but our lives. Back then, I had always sat beside him, slightly behind, letting him lead the conversation while I observed, calculated, and occasionally stepped in when needed. Today, I walked in alone. And for the first time, I wasn't there as someone's wife. I was there as the one in control. The realization didn't empower me the way I thought it might. It steadied me instead, like placing both feet firmly on ground that had been shifting for too long. Daniel was already there when I arrived, sitting stiffly in one of the leather chairs, his eyes tired, his expression distant. He looked up when he saw me and tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Grief does that. It rearranges your face in ways you don't recognize. Clara sat beside him, perfectly composed, dressed in black that looked expensive without trying too hard. Her posture was flawless, her expression carefully measured, just enough sadness to appear appropriate, not enough to disrupt her control. When our eyes met, she gave me a small nod. Polite, respectful,
performative.
if someone didn't know her, they would have believed it. But I did know her. Now, I really did. Mary, Mr. Lawson said, rising from behind his desk. He had been Thomas's attorney for over 30 years, a man who valued precision and discretion above everything else. He shook my hand with both of his grip firm, his expression sincere. I'm very sorry for your loss. Thank you, I replied quietly. We sat. The room felt smaller than I remembered, or perhaps the weight of the moment simply made it harder to breathe. Papers were arranged neatly on the desk, each one representing a decision Thomas had made long before any of us were ready to face it. Clara leaned forward slightly, her attention fixed, her interest impossible to hide completely. I noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers rested too precisely on her lap. She was waiting, not grieving, waiting. That told me everything I needed to know. Mr. Lawson adjusted his glasses and opened the folder. We are here to review the last will and testament of Thomas Caldwell, he began, his voice even, practiced. This version was finalized 6 months ago. 6 months. I felt Clara's reaction before I saw it. A slight shift. A flicker of surprise. She hadn't known.
Good.
Mr. Lawson continued, moving through the formalities first. Charitable donations, personal bequests, acknowledgments of long-standing employees and friends. The expected things. The safe things. Clara remained patient, though I could see the anticipation building behind her eyes. Then we reached the part she had been waiting for. Regarding Caldwell Development Group, Mr. Lawson said, glancing briefly at me before continuing, 52% of company shares will remain under the ownership of Mary Caldwell. Silence. Not the quiet kind. The heavy kind. I didn't look at Clara immediately. I didn't need to. I heard the sharp intake of her breath, subtle but unmistakable. 23% will be transferred to Daniel Caldwell, Mr. Lawson continued, with the remaining 25% placed in a trust for his children, accessible upon reaching the age of 25. What? Clara's voice cut through the room before she could stop herself. She turned to Daniel, then back to Mr. Lawson. That doesn't make sense. Daniel should have controlling interest. He's been running operations for years. Daniel shifted slightly beside her. Clara, no, she said, her composure cracking just enough. This isn't what was planned. I finally turned to look at her. Really look at her. There it was, the calculation breaking under pressure. The mask slipping. The control she prided herself on beginning to fracture. Mr. Lawson remained calm. Thomas was very clear in his intentions. He reviewed this decision carefully. Clara's eyes moved to me.
Sharp.
accusing. You influenced him, she said. It wasn't a question. I held her gaze steadily.
No, y replía.
I stood beside him while he made his decision. Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. Clara, please. But she wasn't done. This is ridiculous, she continued, her voice lower now but more intense. Mary has never run the company. Daniel has. This puts everything at risk. That was the moment I decided to speak fully. Not as the grieving widow, not as the accommodating mother-in-law, but as who I had always been. You're mistaken, I said calmly. The room stilled. I was there from the beginning, I continued. Before the offices, before the contracts, before anyone knew the company's name. I handled the finances when we couldn't afford staff. I negotiated deals when Thomas needed support. I built relationships that kept the company alive in its earliest years. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't stop. You saw what we became, I said. You didn't see what it took to get there. Silence followed. Not uncertain this time. Final. Mr. Lawson cleared his throat gently and continued reading. The house would remain in my name for the duration of my life. The properties, both the main residence and the coastal home, would be protected from sale or transfer outside the family for at least 2 decades. Investments would be managed under structures that ensured stability, not liquidation. Every line, every clause, every decision. Closed doors Clara had already imagined walking through. By the time Mr. Lawson finished, the room felt different. Not tense, resolved. Are there any questions? He asked. Clara laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. This isn't over, she said quietly. I believed her, because I knew her. Daniel stood slowly, clearly exhausted. Let's go, he said, his voice firm but tired. We left the office together, but the distance between us had changed. Outside, the air was cooler, sharper, like something had shifted in the world itself. In the parking lot, Daniel turned to me. Mom, I didn't expect that. I know, I said gently. He hesitated. I trust Dad. I trust you. I just didn't expect it. That's all right, I replied. Clara said nothing, but I could feel it. The anger, the calculation, the next move already forming. As they walked to their car, her voice rose just enough for me to hear. She can't handle this, Clara said. We need to challenge it. I didn't react. I didn't need to, because for the first time in 7 years, I wasn't waiting anymore. I got into my car slowly, closing the door with deliberate calm. My reflection stared back at me from the rear-view mirror. Older, yes. Tired, certainly. But not weak. Never weak. Phase 1, I whispered. Complete. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because Clara thought this was about money, about control, about power. She was wrong. This was about truth. And I still hadn't shown her all of it. That evening, I went home and sat in the study again. The key rested in my palm, familiar now, no longer heavy, just necessary. 7 years of silence had led to this moment. And something told me the next step would change everything. The house felt different after the will reading, not quieter, if anything, louder, but not with sound, with tension, the kind that lingers in walls, in furniture, in the spaces between words. I woke early again, though this time it wasn't grief pulling me from sleep. It was anticipation, a slow, steady awareness that something had begun, and there was no stepping back from it now. I moved through the kitchen with purpose, making coffee, preparing breakfast I barely touched, my mind already several steps ahead. Clara would not accept what had happened. That much was certain. People like her didn't retreat, they recalculated. And if she was already planning her next move, then I needed to make mine first. Daniel called just after 7. His voice sounded heavier than it had the day before. Mom, he said quietly, are you awake? I've been up, I replied. Is everything all right? A pause. Not the kind filled with uncertainty. The kind filled with exhaustion. Clara wants to contest the will. Of course she did. I walked slowly toward the study, the phone pressed gently against my ear. That's her right, I said calmly. But it won't change anything. She thinks it will, he muttered. She says Dad wasn't thinking clearly. That maybe you influenced him. The words didn't hurt the way they might have once. Not because they weren't cruel, but because they were predictable. Your father made his own decisions, I said. I know that, Daniel replied quickly. I told her that. I needed to hear you say it. I closed my eyes briefly. He was caught in the middle, still trying to hold something together that had already started to break. I'll come by today, he continued. Maybe we can talk. I need some clarity. Come for lunch, I said softly. We'll talk. After I hung up, I stood still for a long moment. This was it. Not everything. Not yet. But the first real step. I walked to the study and opened the drawer again, taking out the key. Then I moved to the wall, sliding aside the framed painting Thomas had given me years ago. Behind it was a small safe. Inside, along with the key, was an envelope, thin, unremarkable, but powerful enough to fracture everything it touched. I took it out carefully. Inside were photographs, not the ones from 7 years ago. These were recent, 3 months old. Thomas and I had suspected something then: late nights, unexplained absences, small inconsistencies that didn't quite add up. He had insisted on hiring someone to look into it. I had resisted at first. I didn't want to believe it. But Thomas, he always trusted his instincts. And he had been right. The photos were clear. Clara entering a hotel. Clara laughing with a man who was not her husband. Clara close enough to him that there was no room left for doubt. I sat down slowly, the envelope resting in my hands. This wasn't the same as the embezzlement. This was personal. This would hurt Daniel in a way nothing else could. And yet, he needed to know. Because truth, no matter how painful, is still better than living inside a lie. By the time Daniel arrived, I had already made my decision. He looked worse than before. Tired, hollow, like sleep had become something distant and unreachable. He tried to smile when he walked in, but it faded quickly. Smells like you actually cooked, he said lightly. Just something simple, I replied. We sat at the table, eating quietly at first. The conversation stayed on safe ground. Memories of Thomas, small details about work, anything that didn't require either of us to confront what was really happening. But silence has a way of pushing truth forward. Eventually, Daniel set his fork down. Mom, he said, I need to understand something. I met his eyes. What do you think of Clara? The question hung between us. Simple on the surface.
Impossible dernit.
I chose my words carefully. I think, I said slowly, that your father and I had concerns. His expression tightened slightly. What kind of concerns? I stood up without answering and walked to the counter, picking up the envelope. When I returned, I placed it gently in front of him. Before you open that, I said quietly, you need to understand something. Your father and I didn't want to tell you. We thought we had time. We thought we could wait until things were easier. Daniel looked at the envelope, then back at me. What is this? Just look, I said. His hands moved slowly, almost reluctantly, as if part of him already knew that whatever was inside would change something permanently. He opened it and pulled out the photographs. I watched him carefully. The confusion came first, then recognition, then something deeper. His face drained of color. He didn't speak right away, didn't move, just stared. That's, he began, his voice barely there. That's Clara. I nodded. He flipped to the next photo. And the next. Each one confirming what he didn't want to believe. How long? He whispered. 3 months, I said. That's when we found out. You knew? His eyes snapped up to meet mine. You and Dad knew? Yes. And you didn't tell me? The hurt in his voice cut deeper than I expected. Your father wanted to protect you, I said gently. You were under pressure at work. He thought I couldn't handle it? Daniel interrupted, standing abruptly. Or that I didn't deserve to know? That's not what this is, I said, keeping my voice steady. He was trying to give you time. Daniel turned away, running a hand through his hair, pacing the kitchen like he had nowhere else to put the energy building inside him. All this time, he muttered. All this time I defended her. I thought everything was fine. I said nothing. There was nothing I could say that would make this easier. He stopped pacing and looked at me again. Is there anything else? He asked. The question hit harder than anything else that day, because the answer was yes. There was more. So much more. The money, the lies, the years of deception. But looking at him, already breaking under the weight of one truth, I knew I couldn't give him everything at once. Not yet. Your father was concerned about her priorities, I said instead. That's why he structured the will the way he did. Daniel stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for something. Maybe confirmation, maybe doubt, maybe the truth I wasn't fully giving him. Then slowly he nodded. I need time, he said quietly. Of course, I replied. He gathered the photos, placed them back into the envelope, and held it like it might burn him if he let go. At the door, he paused. Thank you for telling me, he said. It didn't sound like gratitude. It sounded like the beginning of something painful. After he left, I stood in the hallway, listening to the silence return once more. But this time, it felt different. Not empty.
Charged.
Because the truth had started to surface. And it wouldn't stop now. That night, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. I confronted her. She denied it at first, then admitted everything. I'm staying at a hotel tonight. Need space. I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone down. It had begun. Not the end. Not yet. But the unraveling. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Clara would realize something she never expected. I wasn't the woman she thought I was. The house stayed quiet for 3 days, but it wasn't the kind of quiet I had known before. This wasn't grief anymore. This was waiting. Every sound felt sharper. Every moment stretched longer, like something inevitable was moving closer with each passing hour. Daniel texted occasionally, short messages, careful words, just enough to let me know he was still standing. He hadn't come home. He was staying at a hotel, trying to make sense of a reality that had shifted too quickly for anyone to process cleanly. I didn't push him. Some battles have to be fought alone, even when you wish you could step in and take the blows instead. I spent those days in Thomas's study, sitting in his chair, going through files, preparing for the board meeting scheduled at the end of the week. Numbers grounded me. Structure helped. It reminded me that not everything in my life had fallen apart. Some things were still stable, still within my control. But even as I worked, my mind kept circling back to Clara. Not with anger, not even with hatred, but with clarity. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to her. I was anticipating her. And that made all the difference. On the third day, just after noon, the front door opened without warning.
No hesitation. No courtesy.
Just force. Her footsteps were sharp, fast, purposeful as they crossed the hallway and stopped at the entrance of the study. I didn't look up immediately. I closed the folder in front of me first, placed it neatly aside, then raised my eyes to meet hers. Clara stood there, but not the Clara I had known, or the version she liked to present. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, her makeup minimal, dark circles visible beneath her eyes. The composure was gone. The performance stripped away. What remained was something raw, something tense, something dangerous. "How dare you," she said, her voice shaking, not with weakness, but with anger barely contained. I leaned back slightly in the chair, steady. "I assume Daniel spoke to you." Her laugh was sharp, humorless. "You think this is about that?" she snapped. "You think showing him those photos gives you some kind of power?" No, I said calmly. You gave me that power yourself. She stepped further into the room, her eyes narrowing. You've been waiting for this, haven't you? Playing the grieving widow while planning to tear everything apart. I watched her carefully. Every movement, every shift in tone. I didn't create your choices, Clara, I replied. I just stopped protecting them. That hit.
I saw it.
A flicker, small but real. She crossed her arms, regaining a piece of her control. Daniel is confused, she said. He's emotional. He'll come around. He always does. Not this time, I said quietly. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Then she smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile meant to comfort or charm. It was calculated. You think you've won, she said softly. Because of a few pictures? Because of that, Will? You don't understand how this works. I stood slowly, not to intimidate, not to challenge, but to end the illusion that I was someone she could tower over. No, I said. You don't understand. I walked past her, toward the bookshelf, my movements unhurried. My fingers slid along the spines of the books until I reached the one I was looking for. I pulled it slightly forward and retrieved the key hidden behind it. I didn't look at her right away. I let the moment breathe. Then I turned. This, I said, holding up the key, is something you forgot about. Her eyes flicked to it. Confusion first, then something else. Recognition trying to form. I took a step closer. 7 years ago, I continued, my voice even. You made a mistake. Her expression changed instantly. Subtle, but undeniable. I don't know what you're talking about, she said quickly. Of course she didn't. That was her instinct.
Deny. Deflect.
Control. But this time I didn't stop. You convinced Elliot Graves to help you move money out of the company, I said. Small amounts. Careful transfers. Enough to avoid attention, but not enough to go unnoticed forever. She stared at me now, really stared. The calculation was back, but it was different this time. Faster. Sharper. More desperate. That's ridiculous, she said. If that were true, you would have done something about it years ago. I did, I replied. I let that sit for a moment. I stopped it. I continued. I made him return everything. I made him resign. And I chose not to expose you. Why? She asked before she could stop herself. There it was. The crack. Because of Daniel, I said simply. Because of your children. Because I believed protecting them mattered more than exposing you. She laughed again, but it didn't land the same way as before. Convenient, she said.
No proof. No witnesses.
Just your word. I stepped closer. Close enough that she couldn't avoid my eyes. There's proof, I said quietly. Every email. Every record. His written confession. All of it is still there. I lifted the key slightly. In a safe deposit box. Waiting. For the first time since she walked into that room, Clara looked unsure. Not defeated. Not yet. But uncertain. And that was enough. You're bluffing, she said, but there was hesitation now.
Call me on it, I replied. Silence. Heavy.
Final. Then she changed again. Not denial this time. Not anger. Calculation. What do you want? She asked. There it was. The real conversation. I want you to stop, I said. No legal challenges.
No manipulation.
No attempts to turn Daniel against me. And if I don't, I met her gaze steadily. Then everything comes out. No raised voice. No threat. Just truth. She turned away, pacing once, twice, her mind racing through outcomes, consequences, risks. I had seen that look before, years ago, when she thought she was the smartest person in every room she walked into. Now she was realizing she wasn't. You've been waiting 7 years to use this, she said.
No, y correcta.
I've been waiting 7 years not to. That stopped her. Completely. She turned back slowly. Something had shifted. not in her strategy, but in her understanding. "You really think Daniel will believe you over me?" she asked. I didn't hesitate. Yes, because deep down, she knew it too. We stood there in silence, the space between us no longer filled with assumptions or illusions, but with reality. For the first time since she had entered my life, Clara saw me clearly, not as the polite, accommodating woman she could manipulate, not as the grieving widow she could dismiss, but as someone who had been watching, remembering, waiting. "I need time," she said finally. "You don't have much," I replied. She nodded once. Then she left. No slammed door. No final words. Just quiet. And somehow, that was louder than anything else. That evening, I sat alone in the study again, the key resting on the desk in front of me. 7 years. It had taken 7 years to reach this point. And now, there was no going back, because the truth had finally stepped out of the shadows. And this time, it wasn't going anywhere.